Thank you. Welcome. Hello. Nice to see so many faces today. Can everybody hear me, first off? All right. Thank you for answering that question. All right. So, yes, today we are going to cover the forts of Florida. And I'm going to give you an overview, and we're going to progress through. So here we go. All right, we're going to start with an overview of what we're covering. So the general context with what we're doing, we're going to start with the forts of Florida across Florida. And then the strategic context, talking about why it's important. Then we're going to move through the different periods of history that they built forts in: colonial Florida, territorial Florida, and early statehood, American third system, the Endicott and TAFT periods, and post-World Wars I and II, because that's really the end of the timeline. And for each period, we're going to cover a few examples just to save time. There are a lot. Hello. Oh, we're okay. Even better? All right. Progress on to the next slide while we're fixing things. We're even better? All right, yeah, we're rocking and rolling. Okay. All right, so the map of Florida is just covered with forts. You'll see different places and things, and it's just like forts here, forts there, and they kind of fall into two basic categories. Have some examples here on the slide. Former defense sites and cultural areas are prominent: Fort Pickens, Fort Clinch, Fort Caroline. You'll see that Castillo also belongs in this category, and then Fort Jefferson, and my favorite, Fort Zachary Taylor. And then you'll see also most of the map part of forts being part of Florida is cities and places: Fort Myers, Fort Meade, Fort Lauderdale, Fort George Island, Fort Pierce, and Fort Walton Beach are examples of that kind. And we're going to cover why they're there and how they came to be, of course. So moving on to the strategic context. So the fact there are so many speaks to the political, geographic, and strategic importance of Florida throughout its history. And we're going to talk about why there are so many. So forts, we have to start with basically why forts are important and why the military has used forts for a long time, fortifications. They're for protecting borders and cities and other locales such as harbors. And they're also important for expansion of territory, as you'll see. Florida also, most of the guarded territory progressing through time is tied to the coast. 8,456 miles of coastline is a lot of territory to cover and protect, so that's another thing that plays into the number and the importance. Yep, pardon me. So, also, the Gulf and the Gulf Stream are both important. So the Gulf of Mexico is important for trade and also for the rest of the United States territory. And so waterways being part of traveling and getting things around and people around. You want to control your waterways. The Gulf of Mexico is a large waterway, and if you get around Florida, there's all that access. It's American territory eventually. And then going back to the early colonial days with the Spanish, the Gulf Stream traveling up the east coast of Florida helped them to very quickly get around Florida and progress into the Atlantic, traveling back and forth the Atlantic. And also, Florida is the southernmost United States territory, and it's close to foreign entities such as Cuba, which becomes important much later. So the first period we're progressing into, of course, is the colonial period. And, Juan Ponce de Leon discovered Florida in 1513, or he claimed Florida for Spain in 1513, but the Spanish did not stay. They laid claim and then kind of left. So the French came in the 1560s and established Fort Caroline, and which we'll talk about in a second. But you get this progression in early colonial history between the French, the Spanish, and then eventually you get into the British period back further into it. And what's important as establishing territory is the fortifications and guarding what you are wanting to keep. So our European warfare had this long tradition in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries of siegecraft. They wouldn't fight out in the field. They would go to some place and then conduct war. So the fortifications you'll see in early Florida are typical of that time period, and they'll look just like the European examples if you go and look, do your own research. But one thing that's really important to talk about, and I had this question a while ago, was we keep talking about the Europeans. What about the natives of Florida? You want to protect your own territory, or you want to protect where you live. Why are all the names on the map of Florida of all these fortifications and emplacements, why are they all English or European? It's because they were recorded in written history. So what we're talking about largely with this topic is written, recorded European military history. So there was some documentation and there is some archaeological examples out there for natives building emplacements and building palisades, earth and wood, fortifications. But it didn't stay on the map because they didn't control the territory. So that's unfortunate, but that is what's going on with them. So Fort Caroline, of course, just mentioned that Fort Caroline was the first European settlement and fortification in Florida. It was established in the 1560s by René de Laudonnière, and he brought hundreds of French Huguenot, French Protestant settlers to stay in Florida. They were escaping religious persecution, in France, and so they wanted to escape that and establish their own colony. It did not last very long. It was a wood and earthwork type fort with bastions, which we'll talk about in a second. And it was near the St. Johns River in Duval, what's now Duval County. The Spanish caught wind of Fort Caroline, and Fort Caroline, of course, was established before St. Augustine, which is the longest extant city in the United States in North America. And they wanted Fort Caroline to go away. So eventually the Spanish wipe out Fort Caroline and the French. But Fort Caroline was the first place that they established a fort. It's now a national park as well. Progressing on, arguably the most famous fort, save Jefferson, is the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine. So it is in a lovely bastion style. Pardon me. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. So this lovely little graphic on the side of the screen, you'll see the yellow around the corners of the shape. Those are what are called bastions. So what's the difference between just protecting your fort and building something and then putting bastions on it? So basically what the bastions do is they help you to use your cannons, which are the technology that are driving the fortifications at the time that the colonial period is doing. So you want to protect it with the biggest, baddest piece of weaponry you have. You're going to put cannons in your fort. And the bastions help you to cover fire in more places or along more angles. So people could get to the walls of the fort and you can cover the walls of the fort. But also, fun facts about the Castillo, it was built out of coquina, which is soft enough rock that it's said to have absorbed cannonballs. The cannonballs would go into the coquina and just would embed, which is mighty handy. So it was built starting in 1672 by the Spanish, and it still stands today. It's a national monument, a national park. So later on, it progressed into being a fort underneath the British and then the Americans. And the Americans renamed it Fort Marion, which if you research, you'll find out some more about this. So in the 19th century, it was still used by the Americans. And it has an interesting part of its history where it was used as a prison. So Osceola, the Seminole leader, was held there briefly in the 1830s before he was transferred north during the Second Seminole War. And then in the 1870s, they had the members of the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, Comanche, and Caddo tribes. They had members of those tribes. They were removed from out west with American Western expansion. They were relocated to Fort Marion. And it's an unfortunate part of the history of the United States, as well as Fort Marion, and now called the Castillo again. But it's important to remember what all it was used for. It wasn't just used for defense, it was also used for other purposes as well. I'm going to progress on to Fort Mose. This one's really cool. So the fort and town of Fort Mose, it's unique. It is a state park these days. It was a settlement of free Africans. The Spanish had incentivized enslaved Africans from the British territory south. If they converted to Catholicism and swore allegiance to the Spanish crown, they were allowed to be free citizens of Spain. So then they established this community at Fort Mose, north of St. Augustine, and built the wall and lived there for quite some time. You'll notice that unlike the Castillo, which is a complete closed entity with the bastions, Fort Mose has the bastions at the front and the water at the back. The water at the back is a way to escape if you're being attacked, but also tells you, since the wall is towards the land, they expect it to be attacked from the land. So unfortunately, because it's in a marshy part of that area of Florida, it had washed away. It had been built at least twice while it was still, existing. But in the 1760s, the British took over Florida, and so underneath British law, they could have been facing re-enslavement. So the community broke apart, and most of them escaped to Cuba to be in Spanish territory where they were free. So that's the unfortunate part, but it's a really cool site. Here's something closer to home. Here in Tallahassee, we've got Mission San Luis, which is a museum. There is a fort. Mission San Luis was once called San Luis de Talimali, which is the name on the slide. And so you have the mission, you have the settlement that goes with it, and then you have the fort right next to it. It's typical also, you can see that there's bastions on the wall around the fort at the bottom of the illustration. And it's got what are called palisades, which is just that wooden wall around it. And in the middle is a square, blocky thing, of course, called a blockhouse. That is where you would go to protect all the things. And if you had to, oh no, somebody's coming, we're gonna be attacked, you go into the palisade and then you lock yourself up in the blockhouse, unless somebody's at the wall protecting. It's like a safe house within the fort. So yeah, the fort being next to the mission is there to protect it. And proximity is really important at this time for all of these colonial forts. Either the settlement is the fort, kind of like Fort Caroline and Fort Mose, or it's right next to, you have a place of safety right next to the settlement. So the fort at Mission San Luis, I need to mention, is a reconstruction because they had to figure out how to build it through archaeology. Wood deteriorates, but it was really cool that they were able to tell. You see that there's the regular shape of the walls on the illustration. If you go to Mission San Luis, the walls are actually not that shape. There's 3 bastions, not 4, because they ran short of materials. All right, here's another picture of the blockhouse. If you were to go to the museum and walk up to the palisade to go see it, you'd see the pointy, sharp parts of the palisade and how prominently the blockhouse stands out. You can still fire cannons from the top of the blockhouse. Progressing on to the next period, we are going to talk about territorial Florida and, of course, then early statehood. So Florida became an American territory in 1821, and later in 1845 it becomes an American state, the 27th state. And so at this time, there's an effort by the Americans to assert control over the territory. The British had split Florida into 2 pieces of East and West Florida. So it's a lot of coastline, it's a lot of territory within that coastline. How are we going to control it? And we need to open it up to more Americans to settle it. That's the concern of the United States government at the time. So what's really going on in the middle of all of this stuff, the Seminole Wars? So we're going to progress quickly through this one. It's a tough time in history. It's It's an unfortunate part of Floridan history, but it is part of our history. It's important to remember. So early on, even before 1821, you have the First Seminole War, 1817, 1818. And then, 1832, there's the Treaty of Payne's Landing. The Americans are trying to get the Seminole leaders to agree to move out of Florida, to progress to what was called Indian Territory at the time, which now, the reservations in Oklahoma. So they're trying to get them to agree to it, but there's all kinds of misunderstandings. The Americans have one system of governance and the Seminoles another system. Like, they can't speak the same, type of governance. Like, they're not seeing each other eye to eye on cultural levels, and it's going to lead to conflict. So the Treaty of Payne's Landing is where that breaks down. The Americans are trying to remove the Seminoles from Florida, and then the conflict happens with the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, the longest period that they're fighting, and then it progresses on to the Third Seminole War, even in the 1850s, after it's become a state. The United States government is still trying to open up the territory, and by that time, the Third Seminole War, they've progressed from north central Florida into southern Florida, down near the Everglades and like Fort Myers area. So it's about 40 years on and off of conflict with one group of people versus the United States and its citizens. It's a long time of conflict. So, they're opening up the territory technically. Most of the forts from this period are from that 1830s Second Seminole War period, and you'll see a lot of the forts they're built quickly. They're made out of wood. They're not the fancy bastion style you'll see at the Castillo or some of the other longer-term forts from the later periods. They're there to be there a minimum of 4 years at each site so that they can protect and help establish all of these settlements with these Americans moving into the territory. So you won't see a lot of them physically in the wild. They've become different things. They've transformed into like towns and cities. Fort Lauderdale and Fort Myers, which kept their names, and then other places like Fort Brooke and Fort Dade. Fort Brooke became Tampa. Fort Dade became Dade City. So the temporary forts, a lot of them building and connecting to each other, and they're trying to get further and further into the territory. But it's a long period, even with these short bursts of building things and protecting things. And so they progress into the territory, of course. So kind of not really near and dear to our hearts, but there's an interesting part of the permanent exhibits here at the museum, which you could have seen a while ago, but hopefully most of you have seen it. There's Fort Foster. It's a pretty good example that if you've been to the museum, you understand what's going on. So on the left side of the screen is Fort Foster at the state park that it is now. It's been rebuilt, kind of like Mission San Luis. It's built out of wood where they thought it would have been. And you can see that it's almost like a blockhouse on the corner. That is not a bastion. It's an interesting technique. It's built out of more temporary materials. But on the right-hand side, why I mentioned it was something we know about and you hopefully have seen in the past, is there is a diorama in the permanent exhibit of the building of Fort Foster. So this is a photo from like the 70s or 80s when they originally installed this in the permanent exhibits. You'll see them building the palisade, building the magazine, all the little pieces of the fort, because forts are still kind of the same, but the complexity changes. So that's one of those cool things you hopefully we'll be able to get to see again soon. So what goes on next? The next period is the American Third System. So you'll see that it overlaps in time. We're in the same part of the timeline as the Seminole Wars, but this is a different focus strategically, and also the size and permanence is different. And this system of fortification was built to protect the American coastline, not just in Florida. It was over the entire United States at that point, and starting in the 1820s. And it's permanent fortifications too, so these are going to be lasting a lot longer. And there are 6 forts, 6, which is a lot for this system. 6 forts of the third system were built here in the state of Florida. So again, forts to protect the U.S. coast, that's the primary focus of this style of fort. And what really incited this system from coming about was the British burning Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812. It's a really early inciting incident for this system. This system starts researching and building and designing in the 1820s. Construction especially really kicked off with the forts in Florida in that period. And it goes on until the 1860s with the American Civil War. So they knew, because the British could get to DC and burn it in 1812, they knew they needed to better protect American coastline, American shores and harbors, and their citizens. So they went through and started, this whole system. You can typically tell, we've talked about like the stone and the wood of the previous forts. These forts are masonry based. It could be stone, it could be brick, but they're chiefly masonry of some kind. And the third system is, to this date in period, and this is the early to mid 19th century, it's the largest cohesive planned fortification system by the Americans. And it covers multiple borders. The East Coast, which wraps around Florida and goes into the Gulf. The border with Canada, oddly enough, but the Canadians were a belligerent that the Americans were concerned with in the War of 1812. And then only 2 places on the West Coast, Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco, which in the 1820s to 1840s were important at the time. Oh, and one last thing before I progress on to the individual forts. Talking about protecting the coastline, there's a shift in range. So we talked about the colonial forts, and the Seminole War forts as well. The forts were next to or part of the settlement. Everybody could go there and be safe, and it was just, you went right there, and it's right there. It's right next to where the settlement was, where the urban centers kind of would be technically. The third system forts start being at the mouth of harbors. They start ranging away from settled places because their goal strategically is to stop the enemy or the belligerents from coming close to settled areas. They're wanting to make sure they can act as an intimidation and also as a deterrent of, a place to target other than the settlement. So you're starting to see the weaponry also change focus and range at the same time, because it's all about technology. Fortifications is a response to technology overall. All right, so we're gonna go into the third system forts of Florida. We're gonna start with Pensacola Harbor. Pensacola is interesting. It has 3 out of the 6 are just in Pensacola. So, but it was typical for the American third system to have multiple emplacements to guard like the mouths of waterways, because that way you could cover fire from each direction, from either side somebody might approach. So you have 3 separate ones, and they're built in this order: Fort Pickens, Fort McCree, and Fort Barrancas. So why are there so many? Well, they've got Pensacola Navy Yard. Pensacola Navy Yard is basically the headquarters for the Gulf of Mexico and the United States Navy's operations therein. So for a very long time, it's been a point of focus and a point of importance strategically. So they built Pickens because it's at the front of the harbor, and they built McCree to be its pair. And Barrancas, at the meantime, there's basically 3 parts to Fort Barrancas when they built it in this time period. And there's the Spanish water battery, Fort Barrancas itself, the fort proper. It's this airhead shape, which you can see in the postcard photo over here on the top left. And then there's the advanced redoubt, which is even in front of that. The advanced redoubt is even further out to protect from land attack. The water battery, which is the oldest fortification in this whole little system, it dates back to, of course, the Spanish time period of Pensacola. That battery was already there when they started Fort Pickens. So they protected themselves progressively as they built around, which is really interesting. But yes, I forgot to mention that on the right, you see the plan drawing of Fort Pickens. Fort McRee is interesting. It no longer exists. It washed away into Pensacola Harbor. It was on a sandbar, a sand shoal. And it's built in this like heart shape. And it's technically not bastioned. Both Barrancas and Pickens technically have the bastion type system. It's called a polygonal fort, which is a French design style. The French influenced the American third system and a lot of the other fortifications after that very closely, but they were also, thanks to the Marquis de Lafayette and a couple other people, a lot of important French, military architects who were recruited into the American military system in the early 1800s. So, pardon me, we went too far. All right, sorry about that. All right, so we're gonna go over. We've talked about Pensacola in Northwest Florida. We're gonna go over to Northeast Florida, progress kind of over, and then we'll end up at the south part of Florida. Fort Clinch is over on Amelia Island. It's also an American third system fort. A lot of people mistakenly believe it was built back or on the same side as the old Spanish fort, Fort San Carlos. But if we remember, territorial and colonial Florida, they were building close to the city. In Fernandina, on Amelia Island, the fort was right next to the city. They moved Fort Clinch's site. They didn't put it there. They moved it out to the mouth of the Cumberland Sound and not on the river, which is where Fort San Carlos was. They moved it out to the mouth of Cumberland Sound on the Georgia-Florida border. Fort Clinch is unusual. We talked about the 3 forts at Pensacola Harbor. Fort Clinch is by itself. It's the only fort at Amelia Island. They could not build another fort on Cumberland Island because of navigability. They could not get to the island easily. But it's, pardon me, lost my place in my notes. Well, I keep going. So, Fort Clinch was important to control like the coast of Florida. So we're going to progress on. So we're going to go down south, and the last 2, because we've covered 4 so far of the 6. The last 2 are going to be Fort Taylor, which eventually becomes Fort Zachary Taylor. Don't exactly know when it got the whole presidential name, because it was named after President Zachary Taylor back in the 1840s when it was started construction. It was built off of the island, connected by a causeway, so it was completely surrounded by water, as you can see in the painting, which is about the 1860s time period the painting was done on the left-hand side of the slide. And eventually it was updated. It was pretty much complete in the 1860s. It was held by the Union, and then it was updated later for like the Spanish-American War period and slightly after that. And then eventually it becomes, unfortunately, a junkyard for the Navy, and then was rediscovered and eventually became a state park. And you can see the state park. They have filled in around the fort because the Navy had plans to do certain things with it. So now they've dug a moat and tried to simulate what it used to look like. So I can highly recommend Fort Zachary Taylor Historic State Park, but I might be a little partial. So its sister fort. The Dry Tortugas are not that close to Key West, but the Straits of Florida are kind of a perilous place, at least they were in the 1800s and before. So it's 70 miles away from Key West, but it was the closest city. And so you're protecting a very large waterway that's perilous, but you have 2. So Fort Jefferson is that second one on Garden Key and the Dry Tortugas. It did not see any action. It was kind of off the beaten path, but it did play host to the blockading fleet and for the Union in the Civil War. And it was also a military prison at one time as well. But it was one of the first national monuments kind of that happened in that 1930s movement of preserving American history with like the New Deal and everything. And it was put into place by FDR himself. So the American Civil War is the end, basically. the American third system. Florida seceded early in 1861. It was one of the first 3 or so states to secede from the Union. But the period, the conflict changed everything for American military technology, including the forts. Guns got more powerful, tactics changed, so everything was just on the move and changing. So they had been building it since the 1820s, progressively, especially through Florida, and here it's 40 years into planning and building. This is a long time into the system, and this is something they did not plan for because they had military engineers on both sides of the conflict who knew these forts. You don't want your enemy knowing the plans of your secret places or your strongholds. That's really bad for strategy and really bad for protection. But fun fact, 3 of the only 4 forts that were never taken by the Confederates were in Florida. Fort Pickens, Fort Taylor, and Fort Jefferson. The 4th one is Fortress Monroe, and that's up in Virginia. So, pardon me. Yes. So what else happened? There was the sieges that were going on throughout the South because there were forts. They were trying to take territory, especially fighting in the southern states. They were trying to take them back and forth, and they started to be really destructive. And like, oh no, this is kind of me paraphrasing, this is not what we need to do. This is not safe anymore. And the forts were supporting the blockade, which is, if you look it up, it's also technically underneath the name, the Anaconda Plan. So it wound down the East Coast and around Florida into the Gulf, and they were trying to stop, especially the Navy, stop the Confederates from running supplies into their territory. One instance that is really like the death knell is Fort Pulaski. The Union set up a battery of rifled artillery and shot at the corner of the fort for quite some time, and they busted the masonry open. And you can see the hole. You see the gentleman in the photo. They are peeking out of the hole. Behind them is a gap, and then the wall of the powder magazine where they held the munitions. If you blew up the powder magazine, you blow the entire corner of the fort open. So with everybody knowing what was going on, they could tell what was going on, design-wise. They could strategically target and destroy these forts if they wanted to. So it was not good for the planning, and then the technology was advancing to the point that these were not protecting the men garrisoned or occupying the forts anymore. So that's the end of the third system, the American Civil War. It takes them a while to invent a new, or at least think up a replacement. And it comes through with the Endicott and then later the TAFT periods. So these are the next phase. So the defenses need an update. Shifting in strategy overall for the United States Army, you have reconstruction and westward expansion happening. We're moving through larger territories, expanding west towards, manifest destiny in the West Coast. We're putting more men out further from each other, and they're trying to also, you've got this focus on making sure the South is back in the Union and staying in the Union. But then with the Spanish-American War and expansion of American, technically imperialism into, further flung places, you're also protecting the new places like the Philippines, Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War, and then, larger artillery, newer technology to protect against, and then faster ships and better armored ships are running around, not just the Americans, but their enemies. So they have to think up what else to do. In 1885, the Endicott Board was commissioned to survey and then think up a new plan. Well, that's like 20 years from when they stopped building to when they're like, oh, we've got an idea. That's a long time to be thinking about things, but stuff was progressing pretty heavily. Nobody was attacking the United States actively at the time. They were really concerned with Cuba, which becomes a thing, especially in the 1890s. It takes a long time for Cuba to actually become the inciting incident between the Americans and the Spanish fighting. But they're still watching it all that time. There's a lot of development of technology over in Europe as well, with progressing through things that are more powerful and more deadly. And so everybody has to be like, what are we going to do next? So they're thinking about it for a while. It takes them a while. And then 1898 happens with the Spanish-American War, and they actually jump on and they want to protect themselves, especially here in Florida. So we've circled back, and we're now at Fort Pickens again, because it's a really excellent example. And you'll see circled in red is an Endicott battery. They built it in the middle of the old fort. So these emplacements were still strategically located. They could still reuse what they had. They're saving money, but they're also making sure that they've got to use what they have because it's still important. But they also built other batteries outside of the old emplacements. You see on what's over here is the park map next to it. All these little dots, they have numbers on them. They're interpretive places on the map in the national park that Pickens is part of today. But each interpretive stop is an emplacement or a battery. So instead of every little unit of artillery being concentrated in the one fort inside that bastion star, irregular star shape that Pickens is, it's now basically broken up and scattered across the island of Santa Rosa. So instead of we're going to fire at one place, they're firing over an entire terrain. So they decided this was going to be better, and it is better strategically. There's also something else going on with things. Now, you see the other circle in red, I've circled the tower. There's a tower in the middle of what's called the reservation now. It's for indirect fire control. So back in the days with the earlier stuff with forts, you would have the gunner calling the shot, the crew and the one gun, and then maybe someone over all of them coordinating. You get the telephone and the radio, you can move further away from each other. So technology progresses where they can cover more terrain. And you have one source telling them to fire wherever they need to fire without them having to think about it. So you remove the brain to a further away position. And so it changes how they're thinking about the territory. It changes how they're protecting or watching the territory. So forts are starting to not look like forts anymore, but they're trying to keep up with the technology. So there's a couple of really cool instances down in Tampa Bay. These are newer built forts. They're not Fort Brooke. It's Fort DeSoto and also Fort Dade. One is on Egmont Key out in the mouth of the harbor, and the other one is in a local county park. They built new emplacements, completely new, no other fort attached. Concrete and earthwork were the typical thing that all the Endicott stuff were trying to use, because the brick could break apart. Concrete's fast and cheap. You can also rebuild it pretty easily. Earthwork would, like the coquina from Castillo, if you remember, it would just absorb the motion of the cannonballs. So you hide under things that are easier to build, they're quicker to build. If they're destroyed, you can just move or do something else instead of taking 40 years to build these lovely, lovely masonry forts like in the third system. So it's a change in even how they're thinking of building them. And the end of it all, really, because let's face it, forts kind of aren't really built anymore. It's World Wars I and II. So after these two conflicts, it's a complete change in the mentality of what a frontier is and also how to fight. So World War I and World War II, there's a change in mobility and scope. We already talked about the phone and the radio. You then get things like the automobile, the airplane, tanks, and the Navy's still progressing as well. And it just changes how you fight. Instead of fighting on the field, fighting a siege, by World War II, the airplanes are dropping bombs. World War I, they're kind of just flying around doing things. But the battlefield is not just person to person, or place to place. It's now a very 3D, can come from above kind of experience. It changes how they think about it and how they want to put, if they want to in place at all. Field fortifications take over. Permanent emplacements are much less common after these conflicts, and also weapons get deadlier and deadlier, ending up with the World War II and the atomic bomb. Now, bunkers are technically related, but they're not the same kind of fortification. But you won't see Fort so-and-so built or this or that. It's not the same. Forts have gone out of fashion. They're no longer efficient. They don't do what they had hoped to do for such a long time. So they're just not a thing anymore. And they've unfortunately passed into history, but now we can consume them as culture and as places. I tried to mention most of the examples, what kind of place they are now. And a lot of them have transformed into either those cities I mentioned or those cultural sites. I do encourage, if you like this topic, to go out and visit your own forts, because it's really cool to talk about it, but it's a total other thing to go and stand in where these things are and where they actually did stuff. So, they decommissioned the forts after World War II. Coastal forts especially, that protection kind of strategy passed from the Army to the Navy because they wanted to be mobile. And it was also just reorganization after World War II. Like I said, the historic preservation movement was really important for preserving this part of history. So these are my images, and I'm going to leave this up here for later. If you want to come up, the QR code in the corner, these are my sources, or further reading sources I highly recommend. The QR code in the corner leads to the Library of Information Sciences webpage that is called Forts in Florida. They have a whole list of materials that you can go look at yourself, and it's really informative. So that's about it for me. Do we have any questions?
Where is Fort Taylor at?
It's, of course, on Key West. Jefferson, you have to go travel the Dry Tortugas. It's, if you were going on Key West, you'd have to go through the Truman Annex and that part of the island. So it's near what's still there of the Navy. So you have to basically go to the end of the island. And it's over there. It's a really nice beach. It's a really nice park. But it's my favorite. So, any further questions? Thank you.